They went to Doha with the Iranian representatives, but they didn't meet. Both sides are currently at a stalemate. Now, Trump is seriously considering restarting the war and is making preparations for it. What kind of preparations? In addition, American Communists, or rather the Communist Party USA, has scored another victory by securing the first congressional seat candidacy in Colorado. So, communism is on the rise across the United States. This is a clear trend. Today, I'm bringing you 3 data points, 2 major trends, and 1 highlight to watch. So what exactly is going on? Welcome to Good Morning America, brought to you by Feng Wei. Hello to our YouTube viewers and to all the listeners of Sound of Hope, Silicon Valley FM 96.1. Let's get straight to the point. First, let's talk about this. Today's it's Wednesday. Yesterday was Tuesday, and the results of the Colorado primary have just come out. In Colorado's 1st Congressional District, the veteran Democratic Congresswoman named DeGette is facing a challenge from a DSA, that is, Democratic Socialists of America, candidate. This socialist candidate is only 29 years old, which is even less than the 30 years that the Congresswoman we just mentioned has served in office. Back in March of this year, Camares was trailing the incumbent Congresswoman in the polls. He was behind by 33 percentage points. But by June, he had actually pulled ahead by 5 points. So yesterday, he came to challenge DeGette. Will the story from New York repeat itself? That's why, before yesterday's election, the DSA called on people to vote for the socialist and win another victory. Okay, we all know that 30 years ago, socialism and communism had a terrible reputation in the United States. But what about today? Not only has it become normalized, but people can openly call for it. So just how much has America changed without us even realizing it? So let's take a look at the results from last night. As expected, the DSA candidate won, beating the incumbent congressman, who had already served 15 terms, a total of 30 years, by about a 5% margin. So with the DSA continuing its winning streak, you could say that America's communists are now officially moving from New York onto the national stage. Well, now we all know that, besides winning, not just as a candidate anymore, but having already secured the seat, this person called... What public offices are we talking about? The mayor of Chicago, the mayor of Seattle, the mayor of Boston, the mayor of New York, and then D.C. Next up are the mayoral elections in November. Plus, now there's the 1st Congressional District in Colorado and 3 congressional representatives from New York. Then, in addition, in August, there are elections in Michigan and Wisconsin, one for governor and one for senator. This will be the first time we might break into these 2 major battlegrounds, the governorship and the Senate. And in November, we might even win the mayoral seat in Los Angeles. So what's really going on here? What's going on here, huh? Let me show you 3 polls, 2 trends, and 1 key point. These 3 polls, all 3 figures, are from Gallup polls conducted last August. Now, pay close attention to the first number, which is about the concept of socialism. It has already gained the approval of 50% of young people in America. What do we mean by young people? Those aged 18 to 34. Second, what percentage of Democrats now have a positive view of socialism? It's 66%. Can you believe it? So these are the 2 major trends. First, half of young Americans are embracing socialism. Second, more than half of Democrats are embracing socialism. These are the 2 big trends. Now, what's the third number? 54% of Americans have a positive view of capitalism. If you think that's not bad, well, actually, it's the lowest point in recent decades. In 2021, 60% had a positive view of capitalism. It dropped 6 percentage points in just 5 years. So some viewers have commented on my X account saying that in this era, Trump really is a tragic hero. So because, indeed, as more and more young people join the electorate each year, is the overall trend going to keep declining? So that's the current situation. Another observation is this. Among young people aged 18 to 34, the labels of capitalist and socialist have already flipped in meaning. 30 years ago, socialist was a bad word, a negative term, while capitalism was what represented America. Today, in the minds of young Americans, it's already the other way around. Socialism has become normalized and even carries a positive meaning, while when you mention capitalist, it now has a negative connotation. This is also the result shown by the Gallup poll from last August. So you could say that in the United States, after having led and defeated the last wave of communist attacks on humanity, which we're talking about as the US-Soviet Cold War, America today finally has to face the rise of internal forces. And these forces have already won over 50% of young people and are close to taking over a major political party, namely the Democratic Party. This is the rise of homegrown American communism. Are you ready? So what should everyone do? Next, there's another question. How exactly did socialism rise in places like New York and Colorado? Let me give you a very concrete example to help us understand this. Let's talk about New York's rent control. We all know that during his campaign, New York City Mayor Mandani promised to bring many benefits to New York's poor, or rather, to ordinary citizens. Things like free public transportation and free tolls. And then there's things like affordable department stores and also cheaper housing. But in the end, he has accomplished almost none of these things so far. However, last week, he ordered a freeze on the rent for over 1 million apartments across the city to fulfill his promise to help the poor, which he still hasn't managed to achieve. So, what will Mandani's policy and this rent freeze bring to New York? Let me tell you about some of the latest developments. Actually, it all started last December. One example is the New York Apartment Investment Fund. There's a fund like this, and one of its backers is Google co-founder Sergey Brin. He sold off all his shares in this public interest fund at a 6% loss compared to his original investment, cut his losses, and walked away. And after his exit, this fund still has $84 million in unpaid obligations. The rent payments, basically the debts, are still unpaid. So after Brin bailed, he bought a mansion in Florida worth $51 million. He went to Florida instead of California. The second example is the University of California. The University of California is known for investing everywhere, right? It has already written down $120 million of its investment value in this same fund. On the books, it's been reduced to 50% of the original value, now less than $60 million. The name of this fund is A&E Real Estate. Their spokesperson was quite blunt, saying that institutions are fleeing New York because they see New York falling into a destructive cycle. And this is just one example reflecting the actions of big capital. So what can we expect in the foreseeable future? Let me tell you about a few aspects. There are 4 main points. First, freezing rents will lead to a halt in rental income for the rental business. It could even lead to losses, right? As I mentioned to everyone a couple of days ago, costs keep rising due to inflation, but landlords aren't allowed to raise rents. As a result, new developers will disappear. No one will want to come in and build new housing, and landlords who are losing money will pull their properties off the market. They won't rent out their properties anymore, which means there will be no houses available for rent in New York. That's the first blow to New York. The second blow is that people who can't afford to rent will have no choice but to buy, which will drive up housing prices in New York. So what about people who find a job in New York but can't afford to rent or buy a home? Actually, there's only one solution. They just don't go to New York and give up on New York. This is the second blow to employment in New York. Third, when companies manage to hire people but find that employees can't move in, what can they do? They have no choice but to offer employees even bigger, more generous housing subsidies. This means they have to pay even higher costs to attract talent. The end result is that they realize their operating costs have gone up. When they can't take it anymore, they'll consider moving out of New York, driving businesses away. That's the third blow. The fourth one is even scarier or more direct. Landlords who can't raise the rent have no choice but to give up on maintenance. And what happens to buildings that aren't maintained? We all know the answer. So New York's apartments will start to deteriorate. That's the fourth blow. As we all know, the former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher once said, "The problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money." That's not the case in New York. New York won't run out of other people's money because there's no wall enclosing New York. People and money in New York aren't trapped. They can leave, and of course, they leave even faster than the money is spent. But for those who can't leave, they're the ones who have to bear the consequences of New York's deteriorating housing. So this rent freeze in New York is essentially an act of dismantling New York's prosperity. Let me just say this here. Voters in New York, you need to remember that it was you who used your votes to elect a system that is dismantling New York's prosperity. Now, up to this point, I haven't really explained clearly how they managed to get this system in place. Let me elaborate a bit more. One reason, as I mentioned earlier, is ignorance. Secondly, let me talk about some details here. The reasoning behind these small details is very important because what the mandate freezes in New York are the so-called stabilized rent apartments. What are stabilized rent apartments? They are apartment buildings with more than 6 units that were built before 1974. So these are old buildings. It can't restrict new buildings because that would obviously be unconstitutional. So it's either old buildings or certain new buildings that were constructed with some kind of government tax incentives. That's the category we're talking about. So what's another consequence of this? It's that the rent for market rate apartments will rise because stabilized rent apartments are so scarce. So as you can see, what the New York City mayor is doing by freezing rents will actually end up causing rents in New York to rise even more. So now rents that are $3,000 or $4,000 a month will quickly become $5,000 or $6,000 a month. Of course, what I want to say is that the current high rents in New York are actually a result of the semi-socialist policies implemented by the Democratic Party, which has been in full control of New York for the past 12 years. And that's what people voted for when they elected them. We all know that in the late 1990s, Giuliani, a Republican, was the mayor of New York City. Later, Bloomberg took over, and halfway through his term, he left the Republican Party to become an independent mayor. But regardless, the entire mayoral administration and staff were all from the Democratic Party. The Democrats have been in complete control of New York for 12 years now. So, when it comes to New York's high rents, who should you blame? As I've said many times before, it's not actually the result of the evils of capitalism. Or you could say the so-called evil of landlords, the greed of landlords. But in fact, it actually comes from the failure to implement capitalism. It's the result of government actions that cut off the supply of housing. This is what causes these problems. What does it mean to cut off the supply? It refers to rent control. Rent control has been around in New York for a long time. Today, rents are frozen, but in the past, they could only be raised by a tiny amount each year. The result is that developers don't want to come in and build new housing, and current property owners are unwilling to put their houses on the market. So as Mindani puts it, this is cutting off the supply of housing. On top of that, there are all sorts of restrictions on building new houses, which makes it impossible to get new housing built. So what's the situation now? As a result of all this, rents have become so expensive that people can't afford to live here, but they still won't open up or release these restrictions or lift rent control. In fact, now they even want to freeze rent increases. So it's really quite strange. DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, or even the Communist Party in New York are actually using the consequences brought about by Democratic Party rule to convince the young people of New York who are now inexperienced and naive. They want them to implement what was originally brought about by semi-socialist policies. This. Now, in this predicament, they want them to implement full-on socialist rent freezes. This is the bizarre success of socialism in various countries because it wins votes and gets elected by promising to solve your poverty. Then, its policies make society even poorer, and as more people become impoverished, they desperately cling to any lifeline. So they end up voting for anyone who promises them, I can solve your poverty. And these people are the new, even more radical socialists. This vicious cycle just keeps going until the country is completely plunged into disaster. So this is what's happening in America. The story I'm telling isn't just happening in New York. It's also happening in Chicago, in Seattle, in Boston, in DC, in Colorado, and then in Los Angeles, and maybe even in Michigan, and Wisconsin, and so on. So right now, after winning the Cold War, America is truly facing a full-scale impact from the rise of communism at home, even an attack. In this war, which is an ideological war, can the United States wake up earlier than other countries that have adopted socialism? What do you all think? How about we do a poll here? It's finally America's turn. Now it's facing the impact of communism, and this is coming from within, under the guise of legitimacy, with people being elected through votes. Can America wake up more than other countries that have adopted socialism? Will America fall? How about I do a poll here? Do y'all think America will fall to the forces rising from within? To the communists? All right, as I just mentioned, one of our viewers, X3, left a comment calling it a tragedy. Trump really is the tragic hero of our time. I replied and said, I hope he is the hero of our time, not a tragic hero, but Trump really has been abandoned. Everyone who risked their lives to become president, this really is, well, his own choice. Let's talk a bit more. As I mentioned earlier, Sergey Brin, moved to Florida, ran off to Florida. And it's not just him. Now it's almost, wow, all the rich people are running off to Florida, and most of them are from Silicon Valley in California. Let's talk about who's gone there. First, both of Google's founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, have gone to Florida to buy houses. Then there's billionaire venture capitalist Peter Thiel. He's also moved to Florida. In fact, a lot of Silicon Valley's wealthy have moved to Florida. But it's not just them coming by themselves. When the bosses come, the companies follow. So now, California businesses are gradually relocating to South Florida. Like I just mentioned, this is happening right in the Miami Financial Center. They signed a historic office lease. This isn't just about individuals buying homes anymore. They rented a large building, or at least a significant portion of a large building, right in the heart of Manhattan's financial district. The average rent is $250 per square foot. Okay, so before the pandemic boom, well, after the pandemic and before the boom, this building was considered a top-tier office building in terms of rental rates. The rent used to be $40 to $60 per square foot per year. That's annual rent. But now Peter Thiel's coming in and paying $250 per square foot. Why? Because money from California really goes a long way over there. So this building is at 830. It's a 55-story office tower. Not only has it welcomed Peter Thiel's office, but currently Citadel, meaning Ken Griffin's company, also has its New York office there. It's pretty obvious that this is basically calling them out. This building has also attracted New York venture capital firms, Microsoft, and companies like Thoma Bravo. All of them have moved into this building. The local real estate agency is called Blanca Commercial Real Estate. He said the whole area is booming right now. It's so hard because capital can be allocated freely in Florida without interference from radical state governments. What does that mean? It means there's no interference from socialist state governments. Florida also doesn't have a state personal income tax. That doesn't mean there are no taxes at all in Florida. There's just no personal income tax. So there is still corporate taxes. With the successful IPOs of SpaceX, OpenAI, and Anthropic, these three companies will trigger another wave of what you could call an exodus to Florida. Of course, what many Californians worry about is the lifestyle over there. Well, California's lifestyle is great. So the question is, do you really have to sacrifice California's high-quality way of life just for money? This real estate agent said, I think they may have already realized that in Florida, you can actually have both. You can save on taxes and, at the same time, enjoy a quality of life that matches or even surpasses many areas in California. He said that with the influx of capital, the state, counties, and city governments can all do more to help their residents. So this is a huge positive impact. Only with more money can the quality of life for everyone here be improved. At the same time, critics say that Florida doesn't have the deep pool of engineering talent like Silicon Valley. However, experts believe that the local tech hubs are actively transforming. A report from Miami and the so-called Dade Beacon Council shows that tech employment in the county has grown by 25% over the past few years. It has already become one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas for tech jobs in the United States. So what's going on with the state government? Governor DeSantis, just 2 days ago on June 29th, made a move and signed a new fiscal year budget of $118 billion. Basically, DeSantis said that the state budget has been decreasing for 4 consecutive years. You know, government budgets usually only go up, but his has actually gone down for 4 years in a row. Strictly speaking, it hasn't really decreased, it's just stayed flat for 4 years. But with inflation always rising, right? And since Florida's population keeps increasing, the average state budget per person is actually continuing to go down. Also, by the end of the 2026 fiscal year, the state government is expected to still have $18 billion in surplus funds or reserves. At the same time, Florida is also implementing tax cuts, along with efforts to pay down debt. So this state government has been able to shrink its balance sheet year after year and still maintain high reserves. What's the reason for the budget surplus? It's because tax revenues have increased and remain strong. Where does the tax revenue come from? It comes from economic growth, so the strong increase is mainly from sales tax and tourism-related income. This pushes up the base amount, but it doesn't mean that ordinary people have to pay more income tax. There is no income tax, so they don't pay income tax. This creates a very positive cycle. The government gets smaller and more efficient, and wealth stays with the people. Using an ancient Chinese saying, it's like lightening the corvée and reducing taxes so the people can thrive. Florida is able to achieve this today. So you can see, New York and Florida are worlds apart. One is like the sea, the other is like fire. Isn't it just like the title of that novel Wang Shuo wrote back in the day? So we have a lot of viewers here from New York, as well as many from Florida. Would you like to describe your life in New York in just one sentence? And what about life in Florida? I'm not saying you have to answer the way I want you to, just share your real feelings. Do you think life has gotten better, stayed the same, or gotten worse? And for Florida, is it better, the same, or worse? Could everyone share their thoughts? Alright, please leave your comments so we can get a sense of our audience's real feelings. Okay, next, let's quickly talk about the latest updates from Iran. As we all know, after the US and Iran exchanged 2 rounds of attacks over the weekend, both sides agreed to a ceasefire on Tuesday and arranged to meet in Doha, Qatar. So the US envoy Volkov and Trump's son-in-law Kushner have already flown there directly, but Iran refused to meet. Iran said they would only talk to Qatar and ask Qatar to relay messages, so that's the situation now. The latest reports say that President Trump is now considering resuming full-scale war with Iran. Because of this, he has specifically arranged multiple conversations with Secretary Hegseth and General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They are considering how to proceed with further strikes. What happens after getting involved? President Trump still says that, for now, temporarily, he insists on first pursuing diplomatic negotiations. Okay, so the focus of these meetings is whether Washington can accomplish its objectives if it resumes a full-scale attack on Iran. So that's the latest situation right now. In addition, Iran's foreign minister, Kalibov, said in an interview with Iran's state television that the blockade has been lifted as of today. Oh my, during the 50 to 60 days of the blockade, we didn't sell a single barrel of oil, but today we've already exported over 40 million barrels. But the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Bessent, said that so far, Iran has only had one buyer, and that's China. Even before Iranian oil was sanctioned, China was already buying it. But right now, no other country is buying Iranian oil. Why is that? Because they're worried that the US might reimpose sanctions on Iran. So what if the oil gets shipped to Iran and after just a couple of days of selling, it's all gone, right? That would cause a huge impact on the entire industry chain, at the very least creating a lot of uncertainty. So even if Iran is ready to sell its oil, it doesn't mean all necessarily buy it. That's what he said. Bessent said that Iranian oil is still being traded at a discount right now. They can't sell at full price, and that's also one of the main reasons pushing Iran to negotiate with Washington. Also, the US president, not President Manshah, but according to the media, accidentally revealed that the US is taking advantage of the agreement with Iran to replenish oil reserves and stabilize the global oil economy. Then, they're plotting to launch another attack. So, Vice President Vance said, these are his exact words, that the US is using the agreement with Iran to replenish part of its oil reserves and stabilize the global oil economy, and then might launch another attack. So he said, that's why I think the president is just doing what we need to do, using this memorandum period to organize the world oil economy. Replenish the reserves and then see how the situation develops. So as you can see, negotiations are ongoing, but Trump is always ready to take action at any moment. Also, it was specifically mentioned that the 60-day deadline isn't important and can be extended. So in my own words, as I've told everyone repeatedly, I think this negotiation is very likely to fall through. Does it have any effect? If it does, the only effect is that it's just a stalling tactic. So Trump clearly believes that if he can keep stalling until the November election, he can avoid a major political risk and will have to deal with the Iran issue again later. All right, next, let's talk about a few Supreme Court rulings. Why discuss these? Because they're very important for understanding the United States. Let's start by saying that recently there have been 5 or 6 major Supreme Court rulings, but what's interesting is that the one Trump cares about the most is actually the one we understand and care about the least. Yesterday, Trump tweeted that the Supreme Court's historic Slaughter decision was the biggest expansion of presidential power in the past 100 years. This is a milestone decision made at such a critical moment. Wow, why is he putting it so strongly? He posted another tweet, and in that tweet, he basically answered his own question. He said, "The Supreme Court's historic decision today is the biggest expansion of presidential power in the past 100 years, and it's a milestone ruling made at such an important time." He said the same thing twice, so what's really going on here? So what they're talking about is Trump firing a member of the Federal Trade Commission, someone named Slaughter. So that's what this case is about. And Slaughter was appointed during the Biden administration. Trump didn't say why he fired her. Basically, in just a few words, Trump said their philosophies didn't align, so he fired her. As a result, Slaughter cited what's known in American history as the Humphreys executor rule to argue that she was illegally dismissed, and she took the president to court. The lawsuit kept going until Friday. Not Saturday, but Friday, right? And then the verdict was delivered